First of all, everybody, and I'll repeat this throughout the course of the conversation for people that are coming in later, there is a link to a course that we're going to be talking about today, which is a course that Diana and her company, Enodo Economics, offers on their website. I've taken part of the course. It's amazing, and we'll talk about why I think it is. There's also a discount for anyone that's coming in through Hidden Forces for 30%, and there's a discount code in the chat. And so you're going to learn about that course today, and we're going to have a broader conversation about U.S.-China relations, so you have a sense of kind of what that's about. The other thing I want to mention is that these calls are normally available to our Genius community, but I wanted to open this one up today, Diana, because I think that the work you do is unique. I've told you it's unique in the sense that I don't see other people putting together a comprehensive picture of what is going on in real time in U.S.-China relations, and also contextualize, so they don't feel like, even though they're getting dropped in somewhere, they feel like they're having a guided path. It's uniquely good in that it's the analysis is strong. It's complete. I feel like nothing is fully complete, but it's very good. And I think that, we're at I wanted to share that with our audience today, because I think we're at a time where that kind of analysis is needed. I mentioned that normally these calls are for Genius members only. Like I said, I opened this one up today for anyone that's interested in learning more about these Q&A calls that we have on a regular basis, the various in-person events and dinners. You can do that on our subscriber page at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. And if you still have questions, you can email my team or me at info@hiddenforces.io. So, Diana, before we start the broader conversation about U.S.-China relations, and also tackle some of the more recent headlines like the naval exercises in the Western Pacific, which we kind of covered in my recent episode with Alex Velez-Green, as well as the news out of SMIC with Huawei and their new 5G phone with a 7-nanometer chip inside. And that's a conversation about chip restrictions, export controls. All of this falls within the geostrategic competition between the U.S. and China. You offer a course on Enodo Economics, as I mentioned. What is it? What is Enodo Economics, and why did you decide to create this course in the first place, and what is it about?
Well, Enodo Economics is a macroeconomic, political, and geopolitical research and forecasting company that focuses on all things China and its global impact. And one of our key themes over the last 5 years has been what we termed the great decoupling, this all-encompassing geopolitical confrontation, competition between the existing superpower and the aspiring one. And actually in Latin, the word enodo means to untangle, to make clear. So this is what we are trying to do, to really make this complex world we live in, when you have to take in everything that's going on, put it into the same coherent picture in order to have a chance to see the future. And also try and determine what is the key driving force from which everything else will fall out. And our argument over the past, as I said, 5 years now, has been that the key driving force from which everything else will be determined is this great power competition. And we've been analyzing that, as you have seen through our other work, in great depth from all angles. But our clients were saying, look, Diana, we feel like we're coming in the middle of the book. You know, we understand the importance of the relationship, but we haven't really paid attention to this side of things up until really Trump's trade wars. And in order to be able to understand where we are now and also figure out what's going to happen going forward, it would be great to have the history of how we got to here and the history in all its facets, because you can find information maybe on the geopolitical side separately, on the economic side separately, on the technology side separately, but not all together. And why don't you, create some sort of a primer that is concise but complete, and we can quickly get up to speed and don't feel like we're coming into this discussion without the necessary understanding of the background. So it was one of those exercises really in response to our client's request.
So I have one more question about that. Before I ask it, I want to remind people that this is a Q&A, which means that you will have a chance to ask questions. You want to add those to the Q&A box, and what I would recommend is that you formulate them very clearly, and if you think you might have a few extra questions, to try to put them all together in a single bunch of text so that they're easier to go through. And if you want to chat, you can use the chat function to do that. And as I mentioned, there's a link there to this course that Diana has, as well as a discount code. So one last question about this, Diana, which is, what is it that you think people have wrong in their frameworks? Is it the lack of background? Is it the lack of appreciation of the role of the geopolitical, geostrategic competition between the US and China that is driving a lot of these trends? And how does this course help correct that?
I'll give you an example, Demetri. I remember listening to seasoned professional investors like Warren Buffett, Paul Tudor Jones, at the time of the trade wars, when those kicked off. And those guys were saying at that time, oh, don't worry about it. It's a storm in a teacup. It doesn't make sense from an economic point of view, from a profit and loss point of view, that America and China will engage in this type of confrontation. And at the time, we were saying the exact opposite. And I can share actually with you a link to that webinar we did that far back. And the difference was that really those people were assessing the issue from their own point of view without understanding the motivations and the cultural even aspects of how, for example, China was looking at this. And so they made their own conclusion because they assessed it from their own paradigm. So it's clear that for both sides to understand each other, they have to put each other, or they have to put themselves in the other's shoes, and they have to understand where they're coming from. And the same goes for the Chinese. You know, interestingly, let's give an example with the Ukraine story. When I was talking to the Americans were saying, you know, we are showing China with the fact that we have not engaged in Ukraine with boots on the ground, to say that we are laser focused on the Indo-Pacific and on the challenge that China presents. Meanwhile, in my conversations with the Chinese, they were taking what was going on as an example of how America's strength is waning and that they are spread too thin, and it sort of played into their understanding or their perception that the US is in kind of terminal decline. So what we try to do with this course is to really bring understanding on both sides of the equation, and in particular as well with respect to all the other countries and nationalities, to understand how the Americans think, to understand how the Chinese think, and to understand the history of that relationship, so they can then be able, hopefully, themselves to judge better all the evolving changes that we're going to see. Because this is a dynamic now we've entered, and often, I mean, we actually have a separate service, and we don't, you know, that's something different. But what is interesting is that this is a service we set up in August 2020. It's called the Anodo Taiwan Watch. We specifically monitored, it's a separate team that monitors and forecasts the probability of conflict there. And most time up until now, we have had to calm people down because, you know, you read something, you read that, for example, China has made this largest incursion with respect to Taiwan. And if you don't know the background, and if you don't know how to judge that, you overreact or misinterpret it. Or I had people say, oh, well, I mean, if I was, you know, Taiwan, I'll get nuclear weapons. And then, well, actually, just if Taiwan tried to get nuclear weapons, that will be crossing a red line for China, and they will have to react. So this is the type of sort of misconceptions that we're trying to address with providing people, hopefully, with a very concise, but also extremely comprehensive background primer to how we got here, but also make it very current. We're not talking about, we're not spending much time about the distant past. And I must say, in the course, I'm joined by our director of geopolitical analysis, who is extraordinary. He has even more years behind him in analyzing China. He has 31 years working for the British Secret Intelligence Service. He ended up his career as Deputy Director, Head of Operations and Intelligence, but he has throughout his career in the services had China as his anchor. So, and of course, I'm not going to expound on the rest of the expertise at Enodo. We have more than 250 years of combined experience in all these areas. So we're bringing all this together and hopefully helping people answer the question of how we got here and what awaits us around the corner.
So let's talk about that. So one, I like this idea that it helps give people context with things that can occur in the world. Not just use headlines, but events. The analogy I've used before for content that we do on Hidden Forces is something along the lines of, what if you had a working understanding of global terrorism, Al-Qaeda, the Middle East, prior to 9/11. The experience of the terrorist attacks would have been very different for you because you would have had that context. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I want to let's work our way through some of these headlines as an example. So one of the recent headlines that I think people have seen but maybe didn't give them the kind of context they were looking for is the recent headline about Huawei's Mate 60 5G phone with SMIC chip inside of it, 7 nanometers. People that have heard our episode with Chris Miller will have some kind of knowledge of that. They may have it already, but 7 nanometers is less than, I believe, what their previous phone had before the export controls were put in place, which was a 5 nanometer chip, if I'm not mistaken. But it still is, it's been presented as major progress on the part of the Chinese ecosystem. There still is some confusion about how much of this is actually due to innovation in China's economy and within its ecosystem, and how much of it really reflects the looseness of the regulations that the Biden administration imposed, as well as the lagging effect of implementation. But I'm curious, from your perspective, what does this tell us about how does this news fit into the framework that we were talking about earlier in terms of the U.S.-China competition?
Well, it's a brilliant question to address exactly this framework, because what it tells us is that we must not underestimate China. And often in my career, I have been very frustrated analyzing China, because really the analysis span between either being a doomsayer or a Panglossian, either seeing, China's growth miracle, let's say, in the past, and ignoring all the other issues. And we have talked with you during a previous podcast of how China's integration into the world economy led to the global financial crisis, etc., etc. And on the other side, now I feel there is this big swing towards being too negative about China and losing the realistic assessment as things develop in order to understand where this will end up. Because yes, China, that was a critical vulnerability in terms of its ability to develop its economy, progress technologically. Of course, whoever wins the technology race will be the future global hegemon. Both sides know that. And America rightfully and, in my view, comprehensively tried to contain its technology and restrict China's access. But of course, they cannot be 100% certain that China will not get there itself at some point. And I think it's important that we watch and understand what's happening there, because if I give you an example, Kalashnikov, which totally transformed the way of war, was invented during a very repressive system. So typically the argument that, oh, China can't innovate, it's, because it's so close, because it's so restrained, and it's becoming more so now, well, that means they'll fall behind. So I think we need to challenge that narrative. And on the other side of the equation, it's extremely difficult to understand exactly where technologically China is, because on the one hand, they shroud everything in secrecy. And on the other hand, when they make announcements, they go down the route of hyperbole. And,
Propaganda.
well, I mean,
to
whether
elevate
it's
their own.
propaganda or just, trying to please your superiors, but nonetheless, it is a very difficult assessment to make, and one that everyone is struggling with, understanding where technologically China is. But I think the importance of those news is to bring us more to a more realistic assessment, and not to be either in one extreme and thinking, oh, they'll get there, they're superior, they have a better system, or go in the other extreme and say, oh, they'll never get there, it's not possible.
So I have a question about this specific news story. The analysis I've seen suggests that, yes, this is impressive. It's impressive what they've accomplished. But also, if the export controls were tight enough right now, there's no way that SMIC would be able to produce a 7-nanometer chip, maybe not even a 14-nanometer chip. The bigger criticism I've seen, so there is a question, there is a conversation to be had about what should the Biden administration do, right? So put that pin there. What response the Biden administration should have, and that's also a relevant question for investors. But then there's also the question of what is the United States doing, to your point, to innovate or promote innovation internally. People like David Goldman, for example, from the Asia Times, have criticized the administration's approach, which they view it as simply being focused on crushing Chinese innovation, but not doing anything to stimulate the U.S. innovation. What do you see in terms of industrial policy and stimulus, subsidies, et cetera, things that are going to be done in the U.S. and Europe? This also brings us to a conversation about electric vehicles, which China has really started to dominate in. What do you see happening in Western countries to perhaps promote these industries, and what does that mean for investors and policymakers?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that, on the Chinese side, they've thrown huge amounts of money at getting there, and they haven't so far in terms of producing more advanced chips, and they haven't so far gotten there. So they've kind of implemented the of all of nation response to and throwing huge money behind it to achieving the technological progress where they lag behind significantly. On the other side of the equation, in America, innovation and technology is funded primarily by the private sector. But the problem there is that those internet companies, more broadly, take a huge chunk of their revenues from China that they have used for R&D. So obviously, with this bifurcation, this decoupling, that pool of money won't be available in the US for investment in R&D and future development. So rightly, I think the Biden administration has pushed, an American version of an industrial plan, and earmarked substantial funds, the number escapes me at the moment, towards the development of not just bringing back some production and ensuring that America is not exposed in critical supply chain terms to any potential conflict over Taiwan or generally to China.
Is that possible?
But also, well, in the integrated world of today, no. I mean, if we were to have a conflict over Taiwan right now, I can tell you that it will be a totally different world. But anyway, I'm sure we'll talk about that sure. Afterwards. So, there is this industrial policy push in the US with the understanding that really they can't rely anymore on the private sector to do that over the next few years in any case, because of the revenue hit that sector is going to get because of all these restrictions in place and the bifurcation.
Yeah, it seems that, I mean, this is my opinion. It seems that almost every major challenge the U.S. faces is ultimately political. And we'll have a chance maybe to get into that when we talk about, hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about the impact of the 2024 elections, not just the U.S. elections, but also Taiwan has elections in January. We have a lot of people already asking questions, so I'm going to actually start to take some of those as well because I want to get people involved. The first question is, what role or impact do asset managers have in navigating the China-U.S. relationship? What are your views on the House letter to asset managers, MSCI, BlackRock, etc., probing investments in China? Those are two questions, but you can take them together.
Well, look, I mean, clearly from China's point of view, they've thrown the doors of their financial sector open, finally, after years of being pestered about this, to the rest of the world. But because they need that investment to help them cleanse their massive bad debt problem, but more importantly, because they've realized that the next phase of China's development necessitates a developed domestic financial market, and they have lagged behind, so they need also the expertise, especially in terms of fund management. So the Chinese, have thrown the doors open, but on the other side of the equation, we have the US rightly looking at this and saying, well, wait a second, we are sponsoring and our own capital is going into helping the Chinese Communist Party develop. And so far, they have narrowed it down specifically to the PLA or military or products or companies that have a military application. But again, in China's context, because of this all-of-nation effort and this civil-military fusion they practice, often it's very difficult to disentangle what is a private company, what is a product that is purely for civil use versus military use. So on the US side, we're looking at restricting investment in these areas, and asset managers are caught between that. And my advice would be that you have to really realize that you're operating in a totally different paradigm. If you are investing American money, your first question, quite outside of where I'll be able to make higher returns, should be, is it safe for me to put the money there? One, because will the Chinese, will I never be able to take the money away? Or will it turn out that on the American side, I'm banned to do whatever, and then I have to force sell? And of course, some of the big fund managers that have very large positions, imagine what will happen if they have to have a quick forced sale because some regulation comes into play from the US side. So I think we really are living in a different world, in one that investors have to make their choice, and no one wants to, neither investors nor other countries nor big multinationals. Everyone wants to have their cake and eat it, to have one foot in each sphere of influence. And a lot of people talk about multilateralism, but that's not possible. And why it's not possible goes back to the point of technology. In the world of today, with the Internet of Things, with 5G, 6G, etc., everything in our everyday life can be weaponized. And as such, China and America are so far ahead than anyone else in terms of their technological development that no other nation, be it India or the EU, can really stand up to compete and to become another pole, if you'd like, in this desired multipolar world. And so it is bifurcating, and everyone has to pick the technology that they would be using, and as such decide that they will choose.
Would you say that this is also part of the logic behind the hawks, the people who are very adamant about defending Taiwan, that this explains part of the logic for wanting to do that, because they see Taiwan as the kind of binary switch for a lot of countries that are trying to decide who's going to lead that new order, which is still coming into being? Is that part of the explanation, do you think?
Well, look, from just simply military point of view, and where I find America doesn't have a strategy, because imagine if Taiwan turns and says, oh, well, you know what? We've changed our mind. We are going to peacefully unify with China. What does America do then? There is no answer, because if militarily they lose Taiwan, then the so-called first island chain gives China a much stronger position to dominate the Indo-Pacific, and it changes the dynamic of how America projects power, especially in the Indo-Pacific, completely. Basically, the era of the American hegemony as we know it will be over. So Taiwan is much more important, I would say, from that perspective than it is from TSMC and its role in
It's geopolitical, where it's geopolitically located. But that, as far as the polls that I've seen, the polls I've seen suggest that it generally across party lines there is a sense of Taiwanese identity that is separate from Chinese identity, and there's no. I mean, the KMT. It's the KMT is the leader of the Blue Coalition, right? I think they're not pro-unification exactly, are they? What's their position on their relationship to the mainland?
So no, absolutely. You know, if you look at all the polls, I mean, first of all, ethnically, now we have the majority, like 98% of Taiwanese identify themselves as Taiwanese, not as Chinese. And all the polls are suggesting that the majority will fight to keep Taiwan's status as is. Let's not just sort of define it as independent, but just not to change the status quo. And if China were to invade them militarily, they'll pick apart. So in terms of probabilities, the probability of right now Taiwan turning and saying, you know what, we are unifying peacefully is not particularly high. But that's not to say that's not a eventuality that you don't have to think about, especially because from the other side, what China is clearly still trying to do is to follow the carrot and stick approach with respect to Taiwan. I think one of the important things for investors, business people, policymakers to figure out is when the Chinese conclude that there is no other option but the military one. At the moment, our assessment is that they haven't yet quite reached that stage. They are definitely preparing for the eventuality that they have to take Taiwan militarily. They're also working on the assumption that the US and allies will get involved. That's the scenario they're planning for, but they haven't given up on the idea to unify. And what's interesting with those incursions that you mentioned was that, of course, the day before, they announced the creation of this new Fujian being the new economic cooperation zone with Taiwan and trying to be the model. Because, of course, the Hong Kong model for Taiwan, the one country, two systems, was thrown out of the window and was no longer credible anyway, even before all the Hong Kong events, but certainly not afterwards. So China, and Wang Kuning in particular, has been tasked with coming up with a new offer to the Hong Kong people. So they threw this, let's say, carrot, and very soon after, in the crudest way possible, sort of waved a big stick. And, you know, you can't discount the possibility as well that someone sells Taiwan out. You know, it could even be a DPP leader rather than KMT. And just, you know, decides unilaterally to say, oh, you know what, we're changing direction, things are done quickly, and then do people take to the streets or not take to the streets? I think another scenario which immediately came into my head, not just simply because of the way the Chinese have been practicing, could be that the sort of outlying island of, let's say, Kinmen is taken over first. So maybe this traitor, if you'd like, would not have to be Taiwan's president. It could be the local leader in Kinmen saying, oh, well, you know what, we are separating and we identify as Chinese and we are going to join China. And then China gets a chunk that, so, you know,
that
all
complicates,
of these
that complicates any intervention by the United States.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, to an extent, I see much less preparation. A lot of people in the US in particular, if you talk to the Hawks, they focus on America's not investing enough in, you know, in developing our military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, you know, you have competing needs and a fixed amount. So your needs are unlimited and your sources and funds are limited. So it has to be very careful investment. And my assessment is not that America is not doing enough necessarily in the Indo-Pacific in terms of changing its military stance there, and has been very successful under Biden in bringing allies on board. But it is that there are sort of blind spots in the strategy, and this is one of them. You know, what happens in these eventualities?
I feel like when it comes to resources, you know, the truth is that on some level it is perception and everything is relative. I mean, the first Bush administration, and not just the first Bush administration, and a lot of Republicans in the early 1990s were concerned about a $4 trillion debt, and the Bush administration raised taxes. So I think, again, it brings me back to this thing about political will and you know, creating a new consensus in the United States. That's a whole separate conversation. I want to take another question from listeners because we have so many. Nima asks, given the growing alliance of Russia and China in the Great Decoupling, how should the United States balance its financial and military support of the war in Ukraine with the need to prepare for a potential conflict in the Asia Pacific with China? Should the U.S. seek to form a more formal military alliance akin to NATO in the Asia Pacific with Japan, South Korea, and Australia? And I would add to that, Diana, or could we see the U.S. And NATO ramp up its presence in Asia, so therefore no longer being just an Atlantic alliance?
Well, look, I think right about now, America has got the balance right. And the
balance between Ukraine and Taiwan, do you mean? Or the balance?
Yes, yeah. The balance between Ukraine and Taiwan, because they are providing a lot of support to Ukraine, both in terms of intelligence, financial support, trying to rally all the other allies to pitch in, etc., etc. And most importantly, the Ukrainians are fighting themselves, which, you know, no one could say from the start of this whether that would have happened or not. So it's a good example, I would say, because one of the worries on the US side is that the Taiwanese are not ready to defend themselves, and certainly are not keep pushing to having the type of strategy or the type of military or purchases of military equipment that the US thinks will not be the right defense strategy for Taiwan itself.
Isn't that a valid concern?
Yes, it is. Yeah, no, it is a valid concern. The Taiwanese are not following necessarily the porcupine strategy. They want the bigger, flashier military equipment traditionally that they have purchased. But they're changing in that direction under American pressure. And I think the example of Ukraine, of how you have to pitch in, not just rely entirely on the US, is important here. Of course, if you're listening to the Chinese propaganda, they will say, well, America abandoned Ukraine, they didn't help them, and so they'll abandon you. But that's not what is going on. America is supporting very heavily Ukraine's fight against Russia's aggression, remaining laser focused on the Indo-Pacific and on the challenge that China presents. And actually, if Russia were to become significantly destabilized, as there appeared to be a sort of a 24 hours of the possibility of that happening when we had the aborted mutiny by Prigozhin, that really seriously worried the Chinese, because the last thing they need, which will delay their plans, is an unstable, tumultuous Russia on their western border.
So I want to again, I in line with taking questions. Another listener has a question about the economy, which I think is a good opportunity to start talking about this, which we haven't really gotten into. The question, actually, so the questioner asks, do you have an opinion on Peter Zeihan's very bleak outlook? Peter Zeihan is a geopolitical commentator who's written a couple of books, and he's been on this podcast before. Do you have an opinion on Zeihan's bleak outlook for China based on its demographics? I believe his latest prognostication is that China essentially collapses within the decade. I have some follow-up questions to that on the economy, Diana, but what is your view on that? Are you familiar with Zeihan's sort of general outlook that focuses heavily on China's demographic decline? And other people have, guys like Hal Brands and Michael Beckley, who have been on this podcast before, talk about demographics as part of the larger long-term economic challenges that China faces, which might compel them to actually invade Taiwan in this decade. What is your view on that overall, on the overall importance of demographics and the idea of a collapse of China's economy?
Yes, quite a few questions there, Demetri, in one, but
well, overall, let me rephrase it. Sorry, I was trying to find a way to.
I got your question.
Sure.
I'm going to steer clear of answering what I think of Peter Zeihan specifically, or Michael Buckley, beyond sort of saying that I haven't. Actually, funnily enough, I was speaking at an event in October last year where both of them had their presentations as well. And so I listened to what Peter Zeihan had to say then, and I listened to what Michael had to say then too. I don't know if they listened to what I had to say, but what I'd say is that Michael definitely is a China expert. Peter didn't strike me as one, and sort of was monofocused and kind of picking more separately bits without trying to put it all together. And again, it was too alarmist for my liking.
Yeah. I understand.
So, but that's as much as I can comment on and whereas Michael, I think, knew very well what he was talking about. But in answering more importantly your question about China's economic strength or collapse, or where are they, and actually depending on how their economic development progresses from here, how will that impact their geopolitical ambitions and actions? Because the demographics is a well-known massive headwind to China in terms of its potential growth rate. If you look at potential growth rates, they're made up, and this is very interesting actually discussion, because I'm very excited about the sort of new way of looking at this. We have demographics, so the rise in your labor force, then you have the rate at which your capital is growing, and then you have productivity. And that combination determines the potential growth rate. And China has massive headwinds, not just on shrinking labor force, but also on the capital side of things, because they have overinvested for years, and now that they can't grab export market share like crazy and have huge export income, they can no longer do so without debts spiraling up, and they're in a debt deflation dynamic, which means that really you'll have a big drag on potential growth from lots of these capital becoming obsolete and no new investment coming on board. So then really China's hope lies on the supply side entirely in what happens to productivity growth. And as an economist, the empirical evidence over the years is overwhelming across economies that it's productivity growth that by far is the biggest determinant. If you think about it, before the Industrial Revolution, the biggest or the most populous economy was the biggest economy, and that was China. It was the type of productivity explosion that was unleashed in the West through the Industrial Revolution that then led to much smaller countries becoming much bigger economies and leading the fray let's say, the United Kingdom and Great Britain in terms of its empire and global reach. So what is happening to productivity growth, I think, is by far the most important aspect to look at, because that's where they can move the needle. They can't really move the needle on the demographics very easily, even though they're trying in different ways. If you look at the BRI initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, don't just look at where they're building roads and ports, but look at the countries they are mostly roping in. Those will be the most populous countries in the world in 50 years' time or in 30 years' time. Part of the plan is to export a lot of the low value added manufacturing to those countries because the Chinese are not particularly willing to import people and have immigration. And of course, if we go down the robotics route, then we go down into the technology and the productivity story. And sorry.
No, go ahead.
I see you want to interrupt me and ask a question.
Well, yeah. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sure. So
no, go ahead.
Right. So here's what I was thinking of. One is we always reach for analogies, and one of the obvious analogies is Japan. It's Asian, right? It was a competitor of the U.S. And so people are wondering, is China about to face a multi-decade deflationary period like the Japanese did because of overinvestment? That's one possibility, and that's a question. I'm curious to hear your view on it, the comparability. And then I want to add to it an observation, which is, it's a question / observation. Are we wrong to view China through a Western lens in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have been wrong, even though Japan is very different culturally? There was still a strong commercial sector in Japan. It had dynamics that were not unsimilar to the U.S. at the time. I wonder, with the power that the Chinese Communist Party has, if they're less concerned about overinvestment, because they don't particularly see equilibrium as the goal for China's economy in the way that the United States does, because they have larger geopolitical and national security concerns. And so they're willing to run huge surpluses because they want to collect the capital they need to make the investments, to build their position, to strengthen their position against the United States. So those are two kind of separate questions, but they're folded together. Is this comparable to Japan? And if it's not, how much of that is because we consistently misdiagnose China because we look at it through a Western capitalist lens?
Well, taking your second question first, it's not possible to look at China through just the communist or command economy lens, or to look at it just purely from the market economy, free liberal lens. Simply because China has become a hybrid. It is, and they are sticking with that trajectory, and I want to talk about that. And as such, you have to understand how those interact within China in order to get the story right. And I remember the first time I traveled to China was in 2004, and I thought I'll find a country unlike any other. And already from my taxi ride from the airport to my hotel in Beijing, I started feeling strangely at home because, and I'm born in Bulgaria during a time when it was communist. And so it reminded me of my communist years as a child in Sofia, even though by that time I'd lived quite a few years in London. And if you are a Londoner and have never had an experience of what it is like to live in communism, you will travel that same journey that I took, and you will see the massive progress they've made, the huge buildings. And at that time, sort of the party was still pulling the strings, but they were trying to do that behind the scenes, and they put this facade of market institutions, of state institutions. But it's never been possible since 2001, in particular, to look at China through one or the other lens. It has to be through understanding how the two interact in the context of the Chinese economy, system, etc., etc. Your question about Japan, I love this question because comparisons to Japan are very pertinent. In fact, I remember that when I started my professional career as an economist, it was the year 2000, and I started one of the countries that I trained on was Japan, interestingly enough. My colleague at the time, Brian Redding, had written a book called Japan, the Coming Collapse. He wrote it in the late 80s, early 90s. That book was read by people afterwards to understand what happened in the decade that followed. He was so prescient. And again, sadly, he actually passed away this December. Anyway, I'm digressing. But, another paper he wrote was Uphill Capital Flows in November 93, forecasting the Asian financial crisis. So what I was trying to say is that I started on Japan, and it's been instrumental in understanding China. I started following China shortly afterwards, and I followed the two together for some time. And I have been making analogies ever since, or comparing the two ever since, because for starters, the Chinese learned from Japan and followed in the Japanese footsteps, even outside of kind of things that weren't intended but happened to be the same, i.e. that Japan saved excessively and that created the overinvestment problem, and China saved excessively and that created its problems. And those were not necessarily sort of coming from the same place, though there were factors that led to both countries saving excessively that were similar. But China and Japan are also different. And one of the key differences is that, first of all, Japan was an ally of the US. And it was very different interaction. And certainly then, what followed after Japan's peak and post the bubble collapse was Japan sort of kind of, without much turbulence, becoming less important for the world and the world economy. There's no way this is going to happen with China. These two are clear geopolitical adversaries. So that would mean that, and I listened to your previous podcast last week, and you're talking about divorce. The divorce is definitely going to be acrimonious and will be hugely impactful for all of us. But the difference that I think is also important, it takes me to the previous question, is that Japan did not have, China is at the foothills of what is the next sort of industrial revolution, the technology revolution that we're undergoing now. And Japan peaked and went into trouble at a time when this was not there, and that makes a big difference. Because
so what is that? Yes, that's very interesting. I've never heard that framing before. So why is that important?
Well, let me tell you how the party envisages overcoming these obstacles that we talked about, the demographics, the overinvestment. I agree with you. They have sort of pushed the envelope for a lot longer, and this command economy, the command economy part of the system can do that, but it can't do this indefinitely. I mean, the Soviet Union, it was the economic collapse that finally pulled the rug from underneath them. And so if, the Chinese Communist Party also has limits, even in terms of its economic misallocation of capital. It can't continue indefinitely. And they know that, and so they have been pushing for what they term as the supply side transformation. But what always baffled me, and I think I really see their strategy now, is that when she came to power in 2013, he said that market forces will play a bigger role in the allocation of capital. And that has continued to be repeated continuously. Whereas from a Western perspective, all we've seen is the exact opposite. The attack on the education sector, the technology companies, the concentration of power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in 2013, he also said that whoever controls the data has the initiative, which is very important, because sometimes it's translated, I've seen in FT articles, they translated whoever has the data has the upper hand, and they look at it from the perspective of, can control it all. And the fallacy that leads from this type of thinking is that you think, they become more command economy, and the Soviet Union failed, so their system will fail too. But then that's not what they're trying to do. The only way you can square the market forces argument, and they have been moving towards more flexibility, taking, for example, electricity prices. They're fully administered 5-7 years ago, and now there's more market forces playing a role in that plane, and they also are moving ahead with making interest rates and the exchange rate more flexible. But the way they see that they can finally square that with control, their desire for control, really comes from data. They're a huge economy, have loads of data. They're digitalizing every single aspect of their economy, and they'll have that data visibility will allow them a greater sense of control, like an all-seeing God. And in those circumstances, when they talk about allowing market forces to play a larger role, what they actually mean is that because we'll be able to see the problems from sooner, we'll be able to intervene sooner, we'll be able to actually be more targeted with our interventions, rather than in the world before this all-seeing data control, where we had to just blanket responses, which then created much more distortions in the economy. Now,
Sure.
I'm not saying that they're likely to be successful, or we can debate and discuss will they be successful, but this is actually the strategy that they are employing, which could, if they are successful, they could achieve the productivity gains that can offset the drag from the demographics and the capital overinvestment.
Yeah. So I'm going to take more questions. I just want to say that this is why I think that for American citizens and Europeans who are thinking about the threat that China poses to the U.S.-led international liberal order, blah, 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 cannot or should not think about that in isolated terms, that if we're seriously going to try and tackle that, or try and prevent the devolution of the order to become something more along the lines of what China has, we have to also think about what efforts we want to make internally to reform our own societies, which are also becoming more closed and centralized. So it's no good to just throw our lot in with our elite against China and then end up with an elite authoritarian system here, or something that's increasingly closed where our freedoms are taken away. Both have to be navigated together, which is why we find ourselves in such a difficult situation. So I want to take the next question, which is, how would you answer the question, is the U.S. surrounding China militarily? How do you interpret China's efforts to strengthen its defense of its South China Sea coast? So I want to add to that too, Diana, which is to bring up something that you said early on. When you talk to Chinese people in China, there's a sort of a view of the United States that it's kind of in terminal decline. And actually, you know what? Let me put a pin in that question because it doesn't follow very well with Robert. So I'm going to repeat Robert's, and then I want to ask that question. How would you answer the question? Robert says, is the U.S. surrounding China militarily? How do you interpret China's efforts to strengthen its defense of its South China Sea coast?
I struggle a bit to understand what the question actually is asking, because is China is the U.S. surrounding China militarily? Does it mean, like, are they provoking China, increasing China's
Let me tell you how I read it. Fine, let me tell you how I read it, which is why I got confused myself. I read it as, is China responding from a place of insecurity to U.S. encroachments on its territory? Robert, if that's not what you meant, I'm sorry, but that's how I interpreted it, which is why I brought up the whole terminal decline thesis. But I'll ask that next. So what's your view on that, in that interpretation of Robert's question?
I think that it is not just solely China is acting from a place of insecurity. Where this is coming from is really from their 5,000-year history, where for the majority of that time, they were the most important, the biggest, the most advanced economy in the world. And the Chinese have a deep sense of exceptionalism, and then the industrial, sort of losing out in the Industrial Revolution, the 100 years of humiliation was a massive shock to the Chinese. To this day, they haven't recovered. And a lot of what is shaping their behavior right now can be traced back to that 100-year aberration, the way they see it in their 5,000, year-long history of being at the top of the world. So if there is insecurity, it's to do anything they can in their power to regain what they see as the rightful place on top of the world.
Okay.
And that would have happened irrespective of what the US did or didn't do, if you see what I mean.
Sure.
So it's not insecurity that they're feeling, oh, the US is encroaching on us and they're now trying to, contain us, that led us to here. It is that China never intended to not comply, but to be satisfied with the sort of world order as the US saw it after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So America is rightfully trying to deter China by building around militarily alliances, but I think what also is lacking in the American approach, and there has been some work on that front across the American think tanks, of where there is the deterrence, they're doing sort of a lot on that front, but the assurance that some argue is necessary to avoid conflict. So if you just build up militarily and you press and push, you might actually cause the conflict if you don't balance that out with the assurance. And the US is often the terminology they use to the Chinese Communist Party's ears sounds like you will never accept us, and you will just fighting to the death here. So when you say to us, well, we can compete with this and we can cooperate with that, they are not seeing it like this. They're seeing it, the US is out to, kill us and eliminate the Chinese Communist Party. So some of that assurance versus deterrence and how the two are talking certainly needs improvement. But it is not the US military buildup that is actually determining the desire that the Chinese people, not just the Communist Party, have in returning to what they see as their rightful place at the top of the food chain.
So I have a follow-up to that question, but I want to ask another listener question here, and it has to do with how we communicate about our position on China, how the State Department communicates, actually how the State Department communicates, how Joe Biden's administration communicates, how Joe Biden communicates, because Joe Biden doesn't communicate in line with his own administration. So what, the listener's question essentially is like, do we or don't we support Taiwanese independence? What is our position on China? And can you clarify that position for us? And then I have a follow-up to the previous question.
I mean,
it's not clear. It's ambiguous, strategic ambiguity.
But a lot of people, exactly, that a lot of people thought the strategic ambiguity served its function. And there's still people that think strategic ambiguity serves its function and wouldn't advocate for America to change that and outright say that they don't support or they don't buy into the agreements that were reached during the Kissinger era. However, is that, I'm a bit undecided on this issue myself, because I can understand those people who clamor for clarity, largely because, again, having lived in communism, I simply do not want to live in it ever again. And I have that emotional reaction to the issue of where we have to say, we have to defend, but I also realize that in the real world, and in particular, my colleague is very good at pulling me back away from my ideological fervor sometimes, into realizing that it is not, that often you have to play the game differently. especially when it comes to the game played between these two large economies, two large countries. So I feel a lot of the time that the position, when you come to the very extreme aggressive tone and the more ideological position, which I could gladly assume because of the emotion I feel, is not necessarily the well thought out strategic type of approach that really a country, then the diplomats of that country should have. So, can America communicate better? Yes, it can, and I actually find Biden's faux pas the most instructive in where I'm not sure they're faux pas, although he clearly does have a more loose sort of lipped approach. But the problem here as well is that the Chinese cannot understand what is going on. It almost doesn't matter how America will communicate. We almost have to educate the Chinese themselves on how to read America better. I mean, a clear example was the issue of Nancy Pelosi's visit. They simply couldn't understand how Biden couldn't, tell Nancy Pelosi, no, you can't go, full stop. And that created again a lot of issues in how they dealt with it.
Yeah. So I want to go back. I said I had to follow up to the previous question, and it ties into this notion of terminal decline. First of all, do we overestimate Chinese power and their ability to achieve kind of military or economic parity with the United States or surpass them? And parity doesn't mean GDP size or purchasing power parity or whatever. It means parity in a more squishy way. Do we overestimate them, and does China underestimate us? Now, the overestimation is something we've done before. We did it to the Soviets in the 1950s with the missile gap, and seeing all the money that the Soviets and Stalin were pouring into their economy, and they were able to get initially a lot of growth out of that, but it began to peter out, loss of economies of scale, etc. The Chinese similarly, there seems to be this narrative that comes out of Beijing, which is that, and it's not just Beijing, it's Beijing and all their minions who are either, officially affiliated or unaffiliated with the Chinese Communist Party, which is America is a lumbering giant. We are too consumed with wokeism and transgender rights in the military to actually mount a defense of our country. We're an empire in decline. This is Rome, etc. And so if that's the case, so are we overestimating them? Are they potentially underestimating us? And if they're underestimating us, then this idea of the Chinese taking risks in the Taiwan Strait in order to forcibly unify Taiwan seems rather unlikely, in the sense that why would they risk it? If they see America as this headed into terminal decline, and we've all been told that the Chinese think in centuries and not in years, why would they do that? So that's a kind of combined question, but take it however you'd like.
So in my discussions, as I said, for over 2 decades with both the U.S. side of with the U.S. and China, I would say that the majority of what I'm seeing going on in the U.S. is actually underestimating China. If you see, I'm just trying to think.
To be fair, there are different interest groups, right? There are the hawks. Maybe they're overestimating.
Right. Let's say on the economy side, it was up until a few years ago, it was all China, America, etc., etc. And now all the conversations are about China collapse.
Right.
And I don't really see I mean, I am in the sort of more bearish camp on the Chinese economy, but I can give away. It just seems too one-sided to me. So I would say that there is this too much cockiness.
But how much of that informs policymakers? So there, of course, our media ecosystem is like,
I think a fair bit. A fair bit.
It reflects their views on China. It reflects perhaps Biden's view.
To thinking China's great, to China's, a basket case. Of course, there's a lot of military hawks that are saying, oh, they are, they're gonna, do a lot better. We must throw a lot of money at, the military here. China is definitely also underestimating the US. All the narratives that come out of there, though, admittedly, in the last 6 to 8 months, they feel a bit more unsure. But there is a lot of underestimation of the resilience of the American system. And this is dangerous. So going to your question of whether if the US, if the Chinese think, well, America is in terminal decline, we can wait. We think in, centuries, not in years, not in months. So we can just wait for America to implode out of its own accord. Well, why this is not actually, shouldn't make us sleep any better at night is because of Xi Jinping.
Who doesn't think in terms of centuries because he's going to die. He's going to die in a few decades.
Because, the plan originally was anyway 2049 to achieve this national reunification. So why has this issue become much more on the agenda? The first change was the arrival of Xi Jinping as leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and everything that we have, everything that he has done, importantly, not just said, points to the fact that he wants to be the leader that unifies China with Taiwan. Again, we can debate and discuss, but that is our assessment. And so then the timeline shortens. It becomes not 2049, but at most 2035. And then the timeline also is no longer in China's hands entirely. Because while they might be underestimating the US on balance, I'd say more so than overestimating it, they are nonetheless preparing for that eventuality that they have to do it militarily and they have to fight the US. And there is this perception that the window of opportunity is shrinking because America has redirected its efforts and the situation in 5 to 10 years' time will be very different if America then manages to put in place and follow through with the plan that it has.
I also wonder to what degree, and then I'm going to take another question here, to what degree there's a giant risk premium for the Chinese dealing with a democracy like the United States, which has got to be really difficult to diagnose, especially in recent years with our populism, the dynamism of our politics. You got to really wonder, and we are dangerous. The reality is the United States is the biggest superpower the world's ever seen. And our political system, not a political system, but our sort of foreign policy is currently unstable. The Chinese foreign policy is very stable. Ours is not. And we're going through a transition. It's not clear to Beijing where we're going to end up based on elections. It might be a chance to talk about 2024. But question here. One of the folks here has a series of questions. I'm going to take one of them. His name is George. The question is, he asks about India, and I'm going to tag onto it. He says, what is the catalyst for India to enter the political and military equation in a meaningful way? And I want to add to that an observation about China's long-term diplomatic and geographic challenges, which is that even if they broke through the first island chain, it's not clear to me that that's the single biggest problem they face long-term, besides all the other ones we discussed. They've got China, they've got India on their border. India is an aspiring geopolitical power in their neighborhood that's going to surpass them demographically. It has a different political system. They have the Russians who are currently on their side, but they're on their side conditionally because of what's going on with the relationship with the United States. That doesn't have to be an indefinite thing. They have the Japanese who have a power, arguably the second biggest blue water navy. So they've got a lot of long-term challenges facing them. So India, I threw out a lot there, but India, what is the catalyst for India to enter this dynamic in a more politically and militarily meaningful way? And how could that present problems for Chinese aspirations?
So, I mean, I definitely agree with sort of what you described as the sense of encirclement that China has, with not just actually geopolitically, but even thinking geographically, how constrained they are. And so, India in particular, first of all, you have the China-India relationship itself and the border disputes, which could spiral out of control and create problems. You also have, of course, China's support of Pakistan as the arch rival of India. What you just described in terms of China encirclement. Think about that all these are nuclear powers. But
Also very important.
minus Japan, but what I'm told by the experts is that Japan can very quickly turn, and make nuclear weapons if necessary. So India has this long history of non-alliance, and India is trying to play let's have our cake and eat it. And I think so far successfully. I think what is also commendable is that the US is prepared not to push India. They know that they can't push India to form a proper alliance, and they understand what they call a sort of variable lattice network. I forgot again the exact terms, but that they have to have different level of relationships with different allies versus supporter countries, that they can't expect the same level of commitment, involvement from absolutely everyone, because all countries have different positions, different realities. So this is, I think, an important part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, this variable relationship. And so far, the India-US kind of loose being on the same team is just about working out. I think in a Taiwan contingency, there's no way India will get militarily involved. At least that's their adamant argument right now. However, they will be prepared to do, and that's probably what the US will be happy with, is to be on the side of the US and to comply with whatever it is going to be, financial sanctions, economic restrictions, etc., just not, short of actually getting involved militarily. Though, talking to some of the American Navy leadership, it was interesting, but, when I asked the same question about India, they were a lot more gung-ho about the sort of type of interaction and support that they would expect from India. So I think what is happening at the level of the militaries and the navies tends to, that there is a certain dynamic that is sort of divorced from the State Department administration, which can change, as you said, in 24. Yeah. And that was reassuring, because the same actually argument went for France, because this all happened when France was upset about the AUKUS agreement. And then again, from a navy to navy, there is a lot more trust between the French and the Americans that might appear visible when you're looking at the, Macron-Biden.
Right. The French are always complaining. What was I had a thought in my head about, but
now Demetri, you have to apologize to the French.
No, I never.
Going into the wonky direction.
So here's another question. I had a thought in my head, but I dropped it. So here's another question from one of our listeners who asks, who says, China is currently having conflicting policies. Economically, they're focused on stimulating the stock market and attracting back Western capital. Example, recent meetings with Tesla and Apple. On the other hand, they're vocal about their intention for Taiwan. Given the precedent of the Russian stock market impact from the Ukraine war, which I'm not entirely sure what he's referring to there, other than that it was impacted, I wonder why China is still focused on the stock market. They want the cake. Do they want their cake and to eat it too? Maybe you understood that last part. I didn't.
I mean, from the Chinese perspective, what became clear during the sanctions of Ukraine is that were the Chinese to respond in kind, let's say, if that were to happen to them, they can't, because they don't hold hostage any foreign capital in the same way in capital markets terms, although, of course, they did have in terms of the industrial base and all the foreign direct investment. So actually, strategically, they're more exposed if more of their capital is in the West, which was basically they had outsourced IPOs to New York, to London, and have more of that and having more of Western capital within their system, because in the eventuality of a Taiwan conflict, they can block it off and keep, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So they don't see this as a, they see the need to develop capital markets for their own need to develop the economy, et cetera, and they see having foreign involvement in that when they have the ability to, cut off. Especially if we move into, that they've already developed their own global payment system. They have advanced with respect to the digital currency, which they're on the cusp of rolling out that domestically. And, the trials in terms of using that for global payments as well have advanced. So, within 5 years' time, the global financial system will look very differently. But I don't see it as incongruous with their strategy over Taiwan to have some foreign capital as hostage back home.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of what we were talking about earlier, which is how to interpret, what's the proper analogy for thinking about China's economy. And one of the, in that regard, like one of the phrases that I've heard in the past, which really resonated with me, was something that Josh Rogan, who wrote the book Under Heaven, or Chaos Under Heaven, and it was about China. And I encourage people to go back and listen to that episode. But he's a writer at the Washington Post, and I think he said something along the lines of, what motivates China is what's good for the CCP. And so I think, to the degree that I feel, anyway, but kind of, I'm not going to put a point on that because I kind of lost my train of thought because I was also looking at the webinar chat. Diana, as I had mentioned at the top of the show, you have a course at Enodo Economics. In the chat, at the very top of the chat, there is a link to that course. There's also a code that they can enter that gives them a 30% discount on the course. I've read many of the documents from the course. I believe that the way in which you present them is lectures, and I found them very helpful. And I've done a lot of work in this area. I've had a lot of guests on, and I think what you do very well with this course is that you have very well contained, well architected pieces of this puzzle, so that as I said at the top, it doesn't feel like you're getting just dropped into the middle of a story. It feels like there's actually a larger story that you're able to tell for people. And I thought about where else I've seen this, and I've really only seen it in books. I've seen it in like Rush Doshi's book, and maybe Josh Rogan's book, where it's like a comprehensive theory of understanding China, but it's also a kind of ongoing process. And you also do the good job of bringing in the economic stuff and the technological stuff. So for people that are interested in that, they can check it out. The link is in the chat. And I appreciate you coming on.
As ever, the pleasure is entirely mine, Demetri.
All right. So we'll speak again. Everyone, thanks for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you, guys.